Okay. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. I'm very grateful we only have one member of the panel here at the moment, but for people being accommodating, because I'm going to be away on the original date that was expected. And so as a compromise, we're having it on Zoom. I always prefer to meet people, but I know it's hard for some people. In fact, for one panel member, he couldn't get in. Are there any apologies?
None have been received.
Are there, well, for Chris, there are none from me. Any declarations of interest?
Nope.
No? That's great. So may I suggest we go to the work panel, which to me seemed remarkably straightforward and uncontroversial. Did you have any questions, Chris, on the work panel? I mean, in practice, we're going mainly to be going through lots of items in the budget review. So I think the main thing is some items that might have come up here are probably going to be deferred until we get into the budget round. I think that's fair.
And the forward plan was updated right at the end of last week. So in terms of things that have been pulled out, I'd suggest the integrated performance report for quarter two and the Treasury Management mid-year report go to your December meeting.
And I think, do you agree, Chris? That seems very sensible to me. Thanks very much. I'm now hurriedly trying to find, I prefer paper copies, partly because I'm doing this whilst I can get on ModGov now. I prefer to see people's faces and so on while things are happening. Do you have any comments, Chris? I just have one or two, which I think are being overtaken by what was subsequently in the papers, but about the notes from the last meeting. Okay, I had one or two things which I think will come up. Maybe Nigel in particular could nod. There was a note which is correct that there were no assumptions in the strategy around increases to utilities costs or salaries, any of the other major items of expenditure. Am I right in assuming we're going to have some detail? When I know there was a rather wide range in the discussion of utilities, will we have rather more focus by the time we come to the budget?
Yes, you will, Chair. Yes.
Thanks a lot, because that's clearly important. Are we then getting, I've made just an asterisk for myself, I think we're going to get something on the savings from renewable energy sources at the leisure centres and something about the savings from using solar panels. Will we get a paper on that, or at least a note about it before the next budget meeting?
Yeah, I mean, discussion with Paul Spencer about that. So we can certainly get a briefing paper on that. And it might be wise to invite someone like Paul Spencer or Mish Tula to the meeting. Agree. So if Richard or Alice could just pick that up, thank you.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I think these are things which are fairly well highlighted. In the case of Jane Winfield in corporate property, and I guess in that context, provision for debt for commercial lets, Richard sent me a note, I think, just ahead of this about how we do that. I know I agreed in discussion with you, Nigel, that Jane would prefer, I think that's okay, to raise it when we get into the budget round.
Yeah.
What I'm not sure is, should we aim to have a bit of a, because it's going to be quite a lot to get through in the budget round, should we aim in December to have something from Jane? What do you think in practical terms is the best way so that we get good value? Because that's a jolly important aspect, of course. And by then we'll probably have clarity on St Aldate's Chambers.
Yeah, you could have a separate discussion. I mean, because it is such a major part of the budget, you might have a separate discussion with Jane perhaps before we get into the budget. So again, I can speak to Jane on that actually. Are you thinking at your next meeting, which I don't know?
That would be, I know it's getting close to budget, but I am afraid that if we just cover it in budget, I am sure and Chris, I guess, would agree that panel members are really interested to understand that, as it's one of the few items where we hope there's upsides. So I'm sure we will have questions. It's likely to be a major topic. So rather than put it into the crowded budget week, I
Okay,
think.
yeah, okay. Let me have a chat with Jane then,
Okay, thanks
Chair,
a lot.
and I'll see whether we can get something to the next meeting, actually. Yeah.
And then on the park and ride and car parking income, it just says from the last meeting, the notes to be presented at a future panel meeting. Might there be something by December?
Yeah, almost certainly. We, from recollection, I believe we've gone live with the revised park and ride charges, actually, for a three-month trial, I think. So yeah, we should have something on how that's going, basically.
Thank you very much. And then, I mean, these are useful notes because they're a prompt. I mean, one thing which I imagine maybe we have to leave it till the budget setting is, you know, there is a formula for setting social housing rents, which in the modern context is going to give astronomic rent increases. I'm sure it come up in the budget round, but I hope we can get at least some simulations of alternative proposed formulae, because you will know that the expectation must be, especially if energy prices fall, that CPI may be negative for a short while. I mean, do we have any proposals from the council side to be generous to tenants now, but not to be screwed when things go back, if you like, on their side?
I mean, at the moment, as you allude to, basically, the government have got us linked into rent increases of CPI plus 1%. I don't think anyone believes that we're going to increase rents by well over probably 11% by the time we get to September. Actually, I can't believe we're going to go there. We're already modelling different scenarios based on different rent increases. The government have recently come out with a consultation as to whether we increase by, I think it's 3%, 5%, and 7%. And I think the sort of word on the ground is that they're probably going to be near to 3%, actually. So we obviously need to have a chat with the board member, etc., about where they want to go. I mean, anything that comes forward in terms of modelling would obviously be an officer views, basically. Clearly, we won't have a board member steer, basically, or we wouldn't want to be declaring that, basically, at before we set the budget and before we've had that thorough discussion with the board member. So we can bring something forward, but it would be very much, these are officer models, basically. I think it's fair to say that if we get capped at 3% with rising borrowing rates and inflation costs, that's going to be financial pressures on the HRA. That is for certain, basically. So it's going to be a difficult budget set in that area as well.
I know we are having a new government in which at least I certainly have no hope. The sort of the fair solution, which is the kind of solution they've proposed for energy prices, is that if you don't raise it by much now, you're allowed to do some form of catch up later. And to the extent HRA is a long-term investment, I just wonder whether I suppose we don't know, but I would hope to God that we are allowed to offset under increases now, given inflation, with some kind of fair, not onerous formula later. I assume they've said nothing about in the discussion, because it's not a 1-year hit, is it?
No, it's obviously forevermore, basically. If you reduce that, you reduce your base figure, so it's forever in your HRA business plan. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that back in 2012, when they brought in the ability for us to take over our housing and run them as we see fit, they've imposed so many different scenarios of rent capping and voids, selling off your high voids and all this sort of stuff, basically. And I think that's part of the problem in some ways about what may well be perceived as sort of government interference. So anyway, that's where we are. We are modelling stuff as we speak around this, but I wholly expect the government to actually say, from the back of the consultation exercise, to actually tell us what our rent increase will be. and it's unlikely to be, as I say, CPI +1.
No, okay, thanks. No, I was aware of that. I just wonder how, anyhow, we don't know, but it could be, as you rightly say, could be very bad in the implications for HRA.
Yeah.
The last thing, which I'm not sure where it stands, but I really would like to understand better. The last bullet is the price for the purchase of HRA properties. I did query that myself, was fixed at the time of signing the contract with OCHL. Now, from the HRA side, that's probably a good thing. I just wonder from the OCHL side, or Ox Place, as I should now call it, I still find that a funny name, but still, I mean, it has implications. I just wonder if we have an idea what they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that although the price is fixed, that gives an indication to what the HRA are going to ultimately pay. And given that some of these contracts are quite, over a lengthy period of time, and with rising inflation and borrowing rates, those costs can go up. We have on some of the contracts revisited those figures basically simply based on the economics. I mean, no, it's reasonable to have that discussion. Okay, it just happens to be Ox Place that we are using to build the houses. If it was anybody else or any RP, you would have that discussion basically, because it is unreasonable to stay fixed when prices are escalating at such a rate. So I think the signing of the contract gives an indication of what the price is going to be ultimately to the HRA, and within reason that can sort of fluctuate. But I think in the current climate, I wholly expect some of those agreements just to be revisited in terms of the ultimate cost the HRA pays for those dwellings.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that's anyhow. So in a sense, it comes out in terms of maybe overall the cost of new houses is higher, but at least it's done in an equitable way between the two council interests. We're waiting. I know that Ed has other meetings. I think he's got a cabinet meeting of sorts right now, and then he's got something at 7. And I said when he's free, he can come in. Is it okay, rather than start and then sort of get it out of kilter, shall we actually, well, with Laura there, shall we discuss the council tax reduction scheme? Is that okay, Chris? I hope it's not too controversial. I thought the options got very complicated in your consultation, but still, can you summarise it nice and briefly, please, Laura?
Of course, Councillor. The paper was exactly the same as last year's. I'm not going to lie. We've decided to keep the questions the same. So it opens up the opportunity for the council to make a decision upon whether to have a 100% funded scheme or a 96, 85, depending on the different options available to us. And as part of that wider remit in terms of how we fund that council tax scheme, we then ask the people what they think about type of protected groups such as disabled or widow people. So that's where the document is coming from. So we are mindful of the burden towards the cost of the council tax reduction scheme, and obviously it will be going up with the possibility of a cost of living rise, more people may be claiming more benefit going forward. So we are projecting that we will have an increase in caseload, and thus it will have an impact to the council finances. But yes, so what we're just asking for is just some questions, which, as I say, were the same as last year, based upon what do people want. I have to say we were very lucky last year. We had about 400 replies. So I'm hoping for a same type of level of response coming back.
What sort of people responded?
A complete variety. Some people were completely out of the area and they were possibly academics just wanting to make a comment. Some people were people who had a vested interest, such as our welfare support groups. So I know Peter Turville, for example, he might reply, he might not do this year now that he's retired. And then we had some customers who went into the library because I put some paper claims in the library, and I did have, I think, 2 applications come back on paper. So it was very much a variety of different people who have a vested interest.
Thank you. Could I just ask one last question, then I'll invite Chris. But knowing the curious bit of aspect of the scheme which county, to my knowledge, never raises. They are actually the major payer under the formula. Is there any pushback from county on this, or it continues to be a city-led decision? I mean, it will probably cost us, don't you reckon, more than £2 million this year? But,
Yes.
is there any sign that the scheme may not be considered eligible, if you like, either by government or will the county start to raise a stink?
In terms of a national scheme, the government very much are led under the Localism Act to whatever the council wants to approve in terms of as long as you show you've had a consultation period of a minimum of 6 weeks, then we'll meet its requirements to show that we've engaged with the public. In terms of a local aspect, I know that Nigel has been speaking to Lorna over at the county on a variety of different issues that are available. He has kind of alluded to different thought processes that we've had, and I am in the middle of writing a report for Nigel in terms of costing and modelling. As of today, what would it mean if we change this and if we change something differently? But I haven't had any response yet back from the police, but I understand we've got a new police liaison person for us. So I maybe just need to pick up the phone and introduce myself first.
Okay, thanks. Chris, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a very, very minor one. And it's possible that I might have missed it in the papers, and it's possible that you may not know the answer, but on the various kind of proposals and iterations of the scheme is kind of detailed in the paper. There's various proposals of essentially additional levels of assessment as part of the process, whether it be for size of household or for non-dependent members of the house or whatever it is. And presumably that has some additional administrative costs, even if it's quite minor. And I guess it would be good to get a sense of what the increased administrative cost is versus the proposed additional savings by virtue of introducing proposals such as those.
Sure, Councillor. Okay, so yes, you're absolutely right. When we write our scheme, we try to what we would refer to as simplification, because the more complex it is, the more layers of information that we need, the more money it costs us to administer. What we have to be mindful of is that the Local Government Finance Act states that it has to be means tested. So it's not like we could say everybody in a certain catchment on a postcode, for example, they will automatically gain it, because you have to ask the questions upon who is in the household and what affordability they've got. That's the main crux of the regulations. So based upon that, we try to, as far as possible, simplify it as we do, which is why we have what we call a banded scheme. Banded schemes, which we have now, we've had for the last 2 years, historically, not just ourselves, but across the whole country, demonstrate that they do reduce the cost of administration, because where you get minor fluctuations in income levels or universal credit, you don't have to recalculate the claim. It was, as long as it sits within that income band change, and some of them are about £50 a week change, they're quite wide, it means that we don't have to send out so many bills, we don't have to raise then conversations with the public because they might be confused, and it doesn't change direct debits that could be in place. So when we look at the scheme, although we think of it from a council tax reduction point of view, we're also mindful from a revenue collection point of view, because the last thing we want to do is start to raise small debts which are then expensive to collect, and the rest of it there. So we have to have that juxtaposition between at what point do we make the change, and actually is that change cost effective?
Sounds very good and pragmatic.
We try.
Any other questions, Chris? Because I'm going to suggest, and if you agree, that are we asked, I never know whether we're asked to note or recommend. Whatever it is, we are asked to consider and agree any recommendations. I think we're happy, since it is the same scheme basically as last time, which was approved, and we're keeping it as simple as we can within the complexity of the scheme. I think we'll probably go along with these proposals and would recommend its adoption, subject to consultation.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. That was nice and quick for you, Laura. Do you want to stay and join us for the rest of the excitement?
I'm not sure. Just a quick question. Nigel, would you like me to stay for the outturn report? I'm quite happy to.
We haven't got the outturn report, actually. We've got the integrated report. And I can't remember if there's any benefit queries on there, actually. Is there? You're probably okay on this one.
No, I don't think there's anything specific on
Yeah.
outbound benefits on Q1.
In that case, then I want to thank you very much for your time tonight, and I shall see you soon.
Thanks,
Have a good
Laura.
time in
Lincoln,
Thank you.
Councillor.
Thanks a lot. Bye,
Cheers.
Laura.
Laura.
Bye. That was good. Let's now, again, waiting on Ed, and it's nice to have just two of us in the panel. Shall we go to Treasury Management? Is that
Yeah.
okay?
You can do,
And
yeah.
Are you pretending to be Bill?
I'm
or-
pretending to be Bill, actually.
Okay.
I'll see if I can do justice. Okay,
I'm
so
fine. My sheets. Go on,
Yeah.
fire ahead.
So this is the Treasury Management report covering the period for last financial year 21-22. Just in terms of the highlights. So at the end of the year, we had around 112 million pounds of debt investments. Split roughly into fixed investments, i.e., banks, building societies, local authorities, etc., or about 65 million. 20 million pound from property funds, and around 26 million pound in variable interest investments like money market funds, for instance. So that was a general split as at the end of the year. Our interest was about 4.8 million, and that was a favourable variance against the budget actually that we had, and that's a net figure. It's that net of investment interest and also borrowing as well actually. In terms of borrowing, we don't do any external borrowing for the general fund. You recall we've said it on a number of occasions that we have about 198 million of HRA debt, which is debt that we took out in 2012 for self-financing. We don't have any general fund borrowing. So when I talk about borrowing, what I am talking about on the general fund is what we term internal borrowing. This is using your returns or temporary use of your reserves and balances basically to finance the capital payments that we're making. And that is known as internal borrowing. And that is a cheaper form of borrowing rather than going out to external markets actually. So just be clear about that in terms of the term borrowing basically. In terms of the paper, it outlines that we complied with all our prudential indicators that we set, and that's a key point just to note. One of the key ones was around the capital expenditure. We had about £100 million underspend on the capital programme, largely from slippages that were pushed forward into this financial year, and a compensating reduction in the amount of borrowing, notwithstanding the internal nature, that we did in last financial year. In terms of base rates, they were on the march for last year actually, and the last one being in August of this year, taking base rates to 1.75%. If you look at the latest financial information that we get basically on a regular basis from our Treasury Managers Link, they're reckoning that interest rates or base rate will march up to 2.5%, and then even further basically, that first increase up to the end of the financial year, and then even further after that basically to approaching 3% actually. That's their latest predictions, and therefore that's going to affect the council going forward in terms of the amount of interest that it has to pay, and also reductions, potential reductions in other areas. On the flip side, basically, we will have an increase in terms of investment interest as you get higher amounts of interest from your investments, but they won't outweigh the amount of interest and we will incur on our borrowing. There's also mention of minimum revenue provision. I'm going to do a masterclass on MRP, mainly because I probably couldn't do it. Bill is the expert in this area, but sufficient to say that MRP is quite a significant element for us, given the amount of borrowing that we actually do. You might recall there was a government consultation. We were front and centre of getting ahead of that consultation. That came out in February of last year and ran for a period. After that closed, they then put out another consultation in June 2022, quote, just to check that the implications weren't going to be draconian on various government or local authorities. That ran until July 22, and we haven't had anything back from the government in terms of the final sort of outcome of any of the consultations that they've run. What we do now as part of that consultation, any changes that they do bring in won't be operational till the 1st of April 24, which is a good thing. But we wholly believe that based on what we are currently seeing, that they will have some effect on the City Council, but they won't have had as big a draconian effect as we originally thought, actually. And I'd like to think that was potentially because we got ahead of the curve beforehand, actually, because what they were originally proposing was very punitive indeed, actually.
Yeah.
I think that's really the overview of the paper, but I'm happy to take any questions, actually.
Thanks. Chris?
Yeah, only a very small one again, and I suspect Nigel may know what I'm going to ask. There's something that's not explicitly mentioned in the paper, which is in relation to the so-called green bonds with Barclays that the council used to have money in, which I believe now have closed. I just wondered where that money has since gone.
Well, obviously, within the context of our 112 million investments, we're constantly shifting those monies around, and we work on a basis, as I said before, of the SLI principles: security, S for security, L for liquidity, and Y for yield, basically in that order. The actual, I mean, with Barclays, the security and liquidity is not a problem. In terms of the yield on the green bonds, they took a dive basically, and haven't really recovered. We have moved those monies mainly into sort of other money market funds, like Fidelity, for instance, that we've taken out. We currently haven't got any green bonds of that sort. We do continue to look, basically, but at the moment there's nothing coming up on the market, actually. So in view of the need to, say, as one of the principles, to obtain the yield, that's the reason why we've moved them out of Barclays, basically, for the time being. Whether they'll come back at a higher yield, they may well do, or there may well be others entering the market, basically. But currently, there isn't anything comparable with some of the other institutions and local authorities and the like that we invest with.
Thanks. Any more questions, Chris? Hello, Ed. We've actually, in your absence, rattled through the agenda. We have integrated performance, which I know we're waiting for you to chip in with. While we're on, I think we've gone along with the council tax reduction scheme proposals. We've done loads of the agenda. So if I can, just finishing on the Treasury management, maybe I could ask a couple of very basic questions, I think, to Nigel. The first thing is, I'm not sure what the time, if you like, date, the expiry date, the maturity date is of these various loans we have, i.e., as interest rates go up, how much behind the interest rate rises are we likely to be in terms of our basically under 12-month lending? That's a basic question. The other one is, you were saying, you seem to imply as interest rates go up, that's a bad thing for us. I thought that the PWLB borrowing, which you mentioned, is at a fixed rate, so we're protected there. Otherwise, it tends to be internal borrowing and so on, unless and until our capital program suddenly requires external funding. Therefore, it seems to me higher interest rates on our Treasury investments higher interest rates for us is a good thing. Am I wrong?
The reason I say it's a bad thing is because of the impact on our housing company, Oxplace. That will, the rises in interest rates will hit them more than it will hit us, for the reasons that you've just said, actually. So yeah. we do get the increase on the investment interest, and that led to some of the favourable variance I quoted earlier, actually. But the impact will be on interest rate returns from OCHL, or Oxplace, actually, and especially with regard to the dividend, which will take more of a prominence as we go through the MTFP. You recall that the current assumption is that Oxplace should be returning about £12 million of the dividend. So the issue will be with them, basically, because they take the biggest amount of money, actually. In terms of your other question, we generally lock in. There is a delicate balance between locking in for
Yeah.
low periods of maturity. And the lower you go, generally, the less interest you're going to get. We generally try and lock in for 6 months. So I suppose, in answer to your question, it's generally about a 6-month period between when we can bring the investment to maturity and take another one out. Actually, most of our money, or there is an element of the money, obviously I mentioned earlier, about 26 million, which is in money market funds, which are moving. The interest rate is moving on a daily basis. Actually, you've got the property funds, which are more longer term fixed. Actually, they tend to say very, very little movement, basically in the principal and returns, and then the balance of the 60 odd million is subject to those sort of fixed periods. I say generally they're 6-month periods, actually. So that's the time lag that you would have between the two. If you take what we've got at the moment, we have some rates of about, say, 1%, 0.8%, which might have been taken 4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah.
The latest rates that we're getting from sort of local authorities are approaching 2%, actually. So you can see the sort of the effect that time lag might have, actually, but it would only be for a maximum of 6 months.
But I mean, I guess I was thinking, but that we don't need to discuss it now. I was partly interested in, is it evenly spread? I.e., are we lending similar amounts every month, or is it bunched in? And I mean, you said 4 or 5 months. Well, that's going to be rolled over in a month or so when it will be at a higher rate. I suppose we'll never be perfectly matched with how the interest rates are going, but maybe we don't need to discuss that now. I was just really curious in terms of how quickly we might get the pickup in terms of higher interest rates, because it depends on the duration of when those different loans were made. That was all. Yeah,
as I say, the variance that we've got on our books at the moment is about from 0.8 to 2%.
Yeah,
that's the variance we've got currently, and that's within the latest 6-month period. So given bank base rates are moving upwards, that there is again a time lag between higher interest rates on the investments from higher bank rates, sort of thing. It's not immediate. There's a time lag there, basically. But I suppose that 0.8 to 2% gives you some idea of the time lag that we have, and that is in that 6-month period, actually. In terms of when we take out the cash, it does vary. It depends, some of our grants and precepts, etc., or certainly grant payments we get, and precepts that we have to pay out are obviously at fixed periods. So your cash will vary depending on when you're paying those out, actually. So it does vary from month to month. It's not really the same, actually.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, that was more for interest, partly while we waited for Ed to join us. So we're asked to consider the report and agree any recommendations. So Ed, there are just 2 members. We are 4-8. There's Chris and myself on the panel, so it's very high powered. Are you happy to go along with the report and we don't have any further recommendations to make? Thank you. Okay, now let's come. Well, we're getting through this so fast. Let's come to the integrated performance report. And what I thought was it would be nice if Ed, as cabinet member responsible, maybe if he could just say a few words about what he sees as the main points, because obviously this must be of interest to the panel, even if we're just 2.
Yeah, bless you. Thanks, James. And so many apologies for being late on. The Oxford Preservation Trust kindly did a walk around Rose Hill, historical walk. And people were so interested, it took significantly longer with much more discussion than I'd expected. I mean, James, in your email to me, you flagged a few particular issues, and we can certainly talk about these. I mean, candidly, in terms of, well, maybe if it's best if I just sort of offer a bit of big picture as I see it.
Yeah.
Local government has had a challenging time, particularly since, if you like, austerity. So reduction in grants, making us much more reliant on income that we generate ourselves, and redistributed business rates, and so on. Then, of course, we're aware that the COVID pandemic has significantly affected our financial resilience, and specifically, has whittled down and is in the process of whittling down our reserves to around half of their previous level. And it's worth pointing out as well, those reserves weren't just sitting there, they were earmarked for particular purposes. And so, that's unwelcome. And now we end up in a period of double-digit inflation. And the way things have developed, a chunk of that wasn't planned at budget time. So some of it, of course, was anticipated. But we expected to draw on reserves, for example, in relation to commercial property income, and take that back. And I know that maybe an area we talk about. But for example, the scale of the pressure on energy costs was not anticipated and couldn't have been at that stage. I think, James, sorry, just to check, we're in public session, aren't we? Although there aren't a great number of we are in public session, yeah. So, I mean, but again, some of this will be familiar. I may just need to paraphrase a few things. Pay, of course, we're in a 2-year pay deal with our trade unions. We clearly need to think about whether there are any issues on pay.
If you would like Ed to go into private session, I'm sure Chris and I can agree to do so. Would you prefer?
Yeah, I think we'll be all right. Nigel will interject if I start saying things that aren't right, but just to avoid, let's keep it in public.
Okay, thanks a lot.
For now, anyone would be thinking we're in the middle of a 2-year pay deal with our trade unions. Is that enough to enable our staff to handle the cost of living? And of course, we need to be thinking about that and talking about that with our trade unions. And then, of course, when we come to renegotiate our position or negotiate the next pay award with our unions, then, of course, they will be looking at inflation rates. They'll be looking at what's agreed nationally, and they'll be looking at what can be done there. So there may well be an immediate pressure there. There's also certainly, I think, going to be a pressure on the MTFS going forward in terms of staff pay. Building supplies, different will affect us in terms of maintenance now. You've already seen a report which, of course, mentioned this, an increase in costs in relation to Bullingdon, but that will apply across works around our portfolio. Clearly, it also affects OCHL as well. And then we've mentioned the utility costs as well. So there are a fair number of pressures in there. Now, I know officers, and certainly at my encouragement, are trying to bear down on spend as they can. For example, we've recently tightened up the processes around filling vacancies. In the current context, it seems sensible to me to be looking really carefully before we start recruiting, particularly to permanent positions. And the process of scrutiny there has become more robust. You'll be aware of the paper going forward on St Aldate's Chambers and the use of the town hall, which will, I think, will be a valuable additional income stream. And clearly, as part of the budget planning process as well, officers have got a number of areas of interest that they're focusing on, trying to realise some additional savings. I think the other thing, as you know, we wrote to government, we wrote to Michael Gove, and he resigned a day or two later. He was obviously very upset to receive our letter. In fact, no, he was stabbed, wasn't he? Oh well, there we go. Anyway, he, in all seriousness, some of this will depend on how the government under the new Prime Minister responds to the challenges faced across the sector. In the health service, in schools, and in councils, you've got a position where you've got pay claims, placing a burden on budgets as they were set in recent years, and the government at the moment holding the line, they're not really going to offer any additional money. And you've got skyrocketing energy costs, but you don't have any slack left in the system. And so that's going to be, I think, a systemic problem in health, in education, and in local government. And there's then going to be a question of how that's handled. My sense, based on previous experiences, local government will be somewhere near the bottom of the pile when it comes to receiving support. But I just wonder whether councils up and down the country really will be able to suck up these inflationary pressures, pay, utilities, materials, or whether they'll have to do something to stabilise the ship. I think there are also reflections that we've got going forward on what might happen with government policy around local government funding. But that won't, I think, be for this year and the monitoring this year. That will be for setting the budget in future years. Happy to take any sort of questions, comments, things you think we ought to be following, James.
That was a nice summary of a god-awful situation facing us. Chris, do you have any questions, general questions? I mean, thanks, Ed, for joining us, but do you have any general questions for Ed?
I mean, not especially. I mean, the big thing, obviously, being the big unknown at the moment, obviously being the utilities piece, and I'm assuming the answer to this question is going to be no. But I don't know whether there's any sense of yet what the rumoured £100 billion package that Liz Truss is set to announce next week includes, and whether it will touch non-individual utilities costs and go to business and the public sector as well. I'm assuming the answer is we've no idea, but any gossip, rumour, etc. would be useful to know.
So I certainly can't help with gossip or rumour, but I have no particular insights. I mean, but I suppose if you're going from first principles, there will clearly be sections of the economy that will be in such trouble if nothing is done that probably something will be done. I would have, and maybe if that happens at source and it happens with the energy bills everyone's receiving rather than payments, then we would benefit from that. But if it's payments to individual businesses or organisations, then it depends how kind they are feeling towards local government. And we just don't know, do we? And it's hard to tell. But yeah, we'll make the case. Colleagues might be interested that we've had a number of exchanges with the district councils network, and we're helping them with some work that they're doing in drawing attention to the kind of range of pressures which we're facing. That's partly a bit behind the scenes, because I think our view and theirs is that the case will be most powerfully made by Tory councils in the district councils network. That they'll be the better interlocutors there, but officers have been really helpful in providing them with relevant information about that, and also that's been helping them push back on some of what government's saying. So government, I think, has a view that councils' reserves have actually grown since the pandemic, and that basically councils got more help than they needed in the pandemic. And that just certainly doesn't work for places like ours. And we think there's probably a bit of a difference there between districts and other tiers of local government. So we're also giving them some ammunition. And there was a good BBC report the other night, which I recognised some of our handiwork fed into behind the scenes. So see what happens. We'll make the case. And there's absolutely no reason to feel particularly optimistic. I think the one area where there is room for a bit of optimism is around large-scale reform of local government finance. Fairer funding, which is not helpful to us, and business rates reset. I think there's every chance that they may get postponed, and that will help.
Any other questions, Chris? If I may ask you, Ed, I mean, it's a practical question. The one bit of the one possible silver lining in terms of the next year or two would appear to be St Aldate's Chambers, in that we will get, I assume, a good rental income from there. The question I have is, it's fine to say we will somehow reconfigure the town hall, but for the first time ever, actually, I went on a tour of the archives, the rifle range, the prison cells. I mean, it is a wonderful, it's even better than any museum, actually. I don't know how many people have seen the exercise yard for the tiny one for the prisoners. But anyhow, I fear that some of these are going to have to be upgraded to make them usable. I mean, maybe we should put the members down in the basement near the exercise yard. But the question is, any St Aldate's Chambers cost benefit, if you like, for us in terms of revenues? I wonder whether we seriously expect any net contribution for at least a year, because it'll have capital costs. I don't know whether we've had a chance, whether Jane Winfield and co have had any chance to do that. Do you know whether any work's actually been done? And remember, we're in public session.
So I think you'll find a lot of interest in the St Aldhates Chambers report confidential appendix, and that will walk you through it. But some of that is still, I think, the subject of negotiation with the potential occupier, and there are still some moving parts there. And you would expect, in general terms, discussions about things like the extent of rent-free periods to allow for works to be part of that. So that would affect the immediate amount. I think the other thing with the town hall worth bearing in mind, I mean, there's an opportunity which has arisen, which is seriously beneficial financially. I think I can say that in public session, and therefore we are needing to be quite fleet of foot in order to devise alternative accommodation for our staff. And therefore, with the town hall work, part of that will be about getting people in quite quickly, and it may end up being they'll make it as good as they can, but it might be a little bit makeshift. And I think there will be then a future iteration in the life of the town hall where we would probably be able to do more, make things better. But inevitably, what we don't want to do is pass up the opportunity to deliver a significant shot in the arm financially through letting out all of St Aldhates Chambers. On the basis that we haven't got the town hall kind of quite as we would like it long term. So I think that there'll probably be a couple of phases there. Watch this space.
I mean, but would you agree that it sounds from everything we hear as if the benefit to our revenues, net benefit, is not going to come probably in the next budget year? It'll be quite likely to be delayed for all the kinds of disruption reasons, the immediate expenses of removal, maybe a grace period and all the rest. It all is a commercial thing, but I hope people don't get carried away and think suddenly they can increase spending bids for next year.
No, I think that's right. Though I think there will be a significant benefit throughout the life of the MTFS.
Yes.
Thinking back to the budget update, which I think was certainly presented to Cabinet, which I think you saw, the bigger pinch points come down the track in the MTFS anyway. So I think frankly, as we prepare our budgets for the next year or two, we'll be okay. It's challenging, but we'll be okay. Though the points around pay pressures, any cost of living, extra stuff we need to do, and the energy costs and so on make it difficult. But I think the real crunch comes down the track, and that's where the St Aldhates Chambers income would really help.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether, do you want to chip in with anything, Nigel or Anna, as the financial gurus?
I don't think, from my point of view, I don't think there's anything more than Ed's been saying. Actually, it's still very challenging. I mean, you mentioned utilities, and whilst we haven't put any figures in this report, we're probably looking at the best part of a £1 million increase over the next 12 months. Actually, something of that nature. We're in the midst of finalising some figures actually. So in terms of following reports, they will be in there. But we sort of we've highlighted that as a potential issue. But other areas that Ed alluded to as well, commercial rent income, property, is still a very difficult place out there, sort of thing, and especially affecting our finances. Anna, is there anything else just to draw out the report? Is there?
No, we've touched on all the key things: property rental income, utilities is the biggest one. I suppose just to quickly outline the overall favourable variance that we have reported in the report. It's a mixture of different things. One being some extra bank charges and court cost reduction in financial services, and then the Oxford Direct Services have declared a dividend for 2021-22, which we will receive in this year. Therefore, it's an additional budget of actual income this year. And then we've had to do an adjustment as there was a corporate property income stream that had to be declared as capital as opposed to revenue. So we've done an adjustment which nets itself off. And then we've also got a hit on our interest, which kind of follows on from the Treasury Management Report relating to the interest from OCHL due to on their developments. But I think that picks out the key variances that we're reporting.
Thanks. May I ask a general question which does affect some of the, have we finally got over the QL problems? Because do we actually know, like ODS and the like, do people now actually know the true situation?
We are, I think it's fair to say, nearing the end of our problems regarding QL. We're not quite there, although again, and I know you've heard this before, we have made significant progress actually. We are at the final end of testing what we term the sales order processing interface. This is the automatic interface, which basically updates all our ledgers for costs and pays ODS for all the work that they've done on the housing jobs actually, and it does that automatically basically. We are very close to the end of finalising that. We've got a little bit of catching up to be done, but if the first one falls into place, then I think the catching up should run smoothly after that. Actually, it's basically just picking up the backlog. So I wouldn't say that we are, hand on heart, we are there yet, James, but we are not that far away, would be my assessment actually. Yeah, and the team continue to make significant progress in that area.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. No, I noticed it wasn't mentioned specifically, but among when we look at the projections and the efficiency savings, I never remember the euphemism we use, but ICT does feature quite heavily, and I know that we haven't had a happy experience recently anyhow, but it still appears there. I don't think I have anything else that need delay. Ed, I know we're going to have an exciting time when it comes to budget. I was going to suggest, in the interest of just speeding things up, maybe Ed, unless you really want to stay, I think you've got other meetings to attend, we will let you go. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. I've got another meeting, and I've also got a daughter talking about food. So
very important.
Cheers.
You're not
Thanks
taking them to St Giles, are you?
No such luck. Candy frosted. Cheers.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye. Could I just raise one thing, which is, I think, really for you, Anna? I know we always have these red risks and the like. I think in the last meeting, I always tend to raise, I don't see why terrorism is a red risk. I think we should downgrade it to amber. I know it's meant to be objective, but if you ask me, in the scheme of things, it's a background risk. But honestly, I don't know how these things are devised, but it's a risk.
Yeah, I'll defer it to Nigel, because from my perspective, the corporate risks are developed and updated by senior managers, so directors. So Nigel is part of CMT, so he might have a better insight as to why it's a red risk.
Very tactful. Yes.
Sorry.
Don't you believe it? Yeah, as I say, that the role that we play is basically collate the information that we are given, and they are reviewed on at least a monthly basis by the owners of these corporate risks, which generally seem to be are members of CMT. So I would typically be owner for the budget risks, etc. Can't remember who's the owner for this one, but I suspect it's a bit like the treasury management. As to why that's continually a red risk. It's not so much the probability that's causing the rating. It's the potential impact, basically. I take your point, James, in terms of why at this point it still should be red, but I suspect that is the reason why it continues to be red. It's the potential impact more than the probability of it happening.
Yeah, I mean, one could say that things like, I think they appear in some catch-all phrase, but things like, you could now put energy prices. Can you, there are lots of things that we could put as risks that we, maybe we might be able to do a little bit about energy prices. I mean, clearly there are going to be discussions about how we procure things like electric power and the like, but in the case of terrorism, as a city council, I don't think our ability is tremendous. It might be a kind of background risk everywhere. Anyhow, I just find some of these slightly odd, and it's curious because this is all that's ever really highlighted in the discussion. That was my only real point. We have other ones which we maybe will discuss when we get a paper, like external suppliers and the like. Those risks remain there. But that was really about all I was going to raise. So if that's acceptable, maybe we can then, I always have to look at what we're meant to do. We consider the report and we agree, we are happy maybe with this one caveat about terrorism.
Just before that, James, if it's okay, I just have one other question. Sorry, I forgot. Around the regeneration property line in the report. And I wondered if you could talk through that in a little bit more detail, particularly in relation to, I mean, I know we're in public session, so where the specific purchase that is mentioned, we might not be able to discuss in detail, but it'd be good to get a sense first of how pending that purchase is, if it's still the same purchase that was discussed previously, and then where in the report it says that options other than that remain limited. It would be good to get a sense of what that means in terms of the I guess the long-term feasibility of this area. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you picking that up, Nigel?
Yeah. So effectively, this was in respect of a particular lease that we did at the end of, I think it was March 21. Actually, the lease was actually done. We had anticipated that the payment that we got in exchange for the lease would have been a revenue item and therefore revenue income. When we actually entered into the negotiation with the organisation which took over the lease, actually, it became apparent for all the reasons under accounting that we could make the item as a revenue item. That would mean that we would have to maintain more control over that lease, and you do that by putting in break clauses and things like that. If you can't demonstrate control over that property, then even though it's your property and you're leasing it out, they're under accounting convention in terms of the risk and reward. Basically, you're effectively handing that property over to the lessee, and therefore, in that situation, it becomes more of a capital transaction, actually. And in this case, we couldn't negotiate the lease the way that we would like to negotiate it, and consequently be able to treat that as revenue income. So what we had to do in the end was treat it as capital income. You don't lose the cash. The amount of cash that you receive is exactly the same. It's just the treatment of that is such that you have to take it out of your revenue budget and basically put it into capital receipts. The impact is obviously you get a pressure on your net revenue spend, which goes up, but your capital resources to use to finance other schemes goes up actually at the same time. So there's no loss of cash. It's just basically the accounting convention basically which dictates the way we do it.
Nigel, I'm not sure, was Councillor Jarvis asking about the £17 million slippage on the capital regeneration budget? Sorry. So where we had £20 million in our capital budget, but we have in the quarter one we slipped 17 million, and so obviously there's been talk of a purchase. So
apologies, Chris. So the 17 million pound slippage again is I think that's based on the fact that we just haven't been able to secure any additional property purchases which meet the new regeneration criteria, which we have to meet in order to satisfy PWRB borrowing rules. You might recall that there was a change in PWRB borrowing rules, and there needs to be some strict criteria to identify purchases which are of a regeneration nature. You cannot be using PWRB just simply for purchasing for financial gain. In this particular issue, we put around, well, it was the £20 million in the budget. We've been able to get, or we will be able to get around £3 million away on various purchases that do meet the criteria, we will not be able to do the balance. So therefore, we've slipped that balance into next financial year. So that's that particular issue. Actually.
But as the report, we can bring it back if we find an opportunity in the financial year. We can bring the money back to be able to do that.
I guess then, sorry, just the second question on that then is, if currently you're saying the options around that are limited, how confident are you that in future financial years there is going to be scope for making this happen in reality? If presently you're not able to find properties that fall within the regeneration criteria, where does the confidence come from that it's going to come in the future?
There are certain things that we are doing, and I think there was brief mention at the of regeneration activity, basically at one of the, I think it was the council meeting, if I recall. Actually, we can't obviously discuss what those issues are, what those opportunities are actually, but they will lead to significant expenditure in return for increased income. So I do wholly expect to get a fair proportion of this money away in the coming years, certainly over the life of the MTFP actually. And as I say, there are things in train as we speak, basically, which will give me confidence that that's going to happen.
I could just say, for Chris's benefit, because I don't know if you remember, but over the last, I would say, 3 years, we have gone down from an original 50 million
yes,
in this category, which was queried forcefully by panel members, myself included. It was lowered to 20, but it all depends on the opportunities out there that meet these criteria. And the PWLB changes in terms of acceptable criteria have squeezed it further.
Yeah. But as I say, James, I am cited on at least one, if not two, potential regeneration type projects, which hopefully will meet the criteria, be regenerative in its nature, and basically give us some financial return for the medium-term financial plan.
Which is what we're seeking.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Chris? So with that, I think I scribbled one or two things, but I don't know if they were at all important, and I think they've been clarified. Excuse me, as we go through. So may we therefore do what we're asked to do to consider it, and I don't think we have any specific recommendations to make, so it must be a very good report. Thank you. Don't know if Anna's dog agrees, but
she keeps saying, doesn't she? Yeah.
Okay, so thanks very much. So let's now turn to, besides we finally note the dates for future meetings, but the scrutiny performance monitoring, for which many thanks. Bear with me while I find what I scribbled on the sheets. Did you have any comments on that?
Sorry, Chair, before you move to discussing it, I've received a couple of late updates to it, which, if you're happy for me to summarise briefly orally. So on the top one, BI038, there's now a comment that says this figure represents the last 12 months and equates to 94 leavers. The average for annual turnover is now back at pre-pandemic levels.
Thanks.
CH001, the next one down, days lost to sickness, should be green, and in June actual it should say 5.45. And there is another one, but I can't find which one it is. Excuse B1038. No, that's that one. Sorry, I had these written down clearly and have lost my. Sorry about this.
That's okay.
CS025, which is on the second page, I think. Percentage of business rates collected. Commentary has been added to say NDR collection remains above target, we're looking to book our first magistrates court shortly. And CS02, no, that's that one. 025.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to put the light on.
And RS005, which is on page 4, the top of page 4.
Yeah.
Commentary added says, this is a tracking indicator that we use to measure the reactive demand for the service. The numbers are wholly dependent on tenants contacting the service who are at risk of eviction in the PRS.
Well,
And those are the 4 updates.
thank you very much indeed. So, Chris, do you have any comments, questions, whatever?
Yeah, most of mine have been answered actually by that because they were mostly queries on numbers and so on. But no, I had one specific one which may well be better suited for the housing panel. But on the final performance indicator on the number of our sleepers, obviously it's disappointing that number is higher than the target. I guess I don't know whether anybody here knows the answer, but it'd be good to get a sense of what proportion of those people we think have no recourse to public funds, because presumably if they do have no recourse to public funds, there's very little that we can do to actually meet that target. For example, if all 34 of those people have no recourse to public funds, then the council's ability to actually offer them accommodation is very limited, and so it'd be good to get, but on the other hand, if it's actually 32 of those people do have recourse to public funds, then that's a whole different conversation to be having, and that to me seems like a pretty key piece of information for us to have in terms of assessing the actual performance against that.
I thought, but I can't, of course I won't find it now. I thought that at some point in the narrative, and it wasn't there, you're right that it mentioned 34 didn't have an offer of accommodation, but I thought somewhere it did say something about people with no recourse to public funds, but of course I won't find it.
I think it just says that the government acknowledges there is little that local authorities can do to assist people with no recourse to public funds. I don't recall seeing anything more detailed than that.
No, okay, I'm just trying to see, because there's some of them are much more detailed than others. Now, it may be that I can confuse the 34 with that, but
Yes, it simply says there are also a number of people who aren't specifying the number.
No, I mean, it must surely be a growing problem, in fact.
If you want to know the number, I would suggest we put a question into Neris.
Yes. I mean, it may be, as Chris said, with the housing panel, maybe at some point. I mean, this is a target, and it's slightly curious. It falls between the cracks in terms of government policy and obligations to provide funding. Would it be appropriate when we come, or would it be overloading when we come to the budget sessions to discuss housing and we get the housing panel? I'm sure Neris will be there. Maybe we can raise it then and just give her prior notice so that she can give some idea of the options. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I put for myself on this whole nasty question of rough sleepers. Is there going to be a further review? But I don't know. One thing, a general point, which I like the way these are presented, although sometimes absolute numbers get, like on the first sheet, the third item, some is absolute numbers, some are a percentage, and sometimes 0.05 is given instead of 5%. I mean, there's a slight formatting issue and comparative things. But what I felt, unless there's a compelling reason why not, I'm always interested to compare with the year before. If there's seasonality, that's why you compare with the year before, because it avoids the seasonality. You're comparing apples with apples. But what we now have is, we at least have slightly better ones. We've got, if you like, June 22 target, June 22 actual, and then we have March actual. But I'm not really quite sure. I suppose ultimately we just want to know, whatever the target, are we making progress if we don't achieve the target? But I don't want to burden this with even more columns. So I'm not quite sure the best way to do it. And I would also say, maybe this is unfair, because some officers have taken a lot of trouble to write a lot in the comments. Mish, I noticed, went to town on his comments in one question, but I'm not sure in this context it's terribly useful, to be honest. Maybe it could be a note elsewhere, footnote, but maybe, what do you think about doing it? Because I honestly, whenever if you ever saw the speeches, including some I'm giving in Peru this week, I always compare things with the year before, just to understand underlying trends. Do you think that's useful? I'm looking on my screen at Nigel, but it could be any of you.
Yeah, I think, well, I would like to think that most of the officers who are putting these together have got the previous year's position. So add in another column, making it clear this is June 22 actual, but what does June 21 actual say?
Yeah.
I would have thought that could be added in basically.
Because the kind of thing is, just to take one, total income collection as percent of plan, council tax, it's in the 29% range. Well, if I multiply by 4, that's well over 100%. So it's clearly not that way. I want to know, is 29% normal for Q1? Is it front loaded and that sort of thing? I just wonder how we're doing compared with the past. You probably can think of a better way of doing it, but I'm not quite sure how much I deduce from this in terms of improving performance. One thing I wondered in terms of the number of face-to-face visits, if I understand it correctly, that I was really surprised because we've moved to the county library, the Westgate. Am I right in interpreting this? Because I've heard Westgate Library is not available that much of the week, and I think it's even restricted hours. I'm very surprised if the number of face-to-face visits has increased in relation to the workload, unless there is just much more pressure than there was before. I just wonder, have I misunderstood? I wonder generally how the library is considered to be working.
I think my understanding, James, is what you said. I think generally there's just more work, and despite the reduced hours basically than were there previously when it was at SAC, that there is an increased number of face-to-face visits at the library. That's my understanding.
Okay. It is surprising, as I said, given that it's less available, fewer days, fewer hours, and it's hard to find, but still, maybe it just shows the pressure. Sorry. Maybe it might be nice as and when we next see Helen. I'd just be interested, because that was a fairly substantial change in how we provide the service and save our own costs. I just wondered how it was considered to be working. Very pedantic thing on quarterly update on 5-year housing delivery supply. They say it's 460 completions in 22-23 in the note. I divide it by 4 and I get 115. I don't know where 108 comes from, which is what's stated in the text. So I don't quite, that's being pedantic, but I like numbers to make sense. More generally, these are ones, I think one I've raised before, the physically active adults numbers, where they give an incredibly accurate figure. God alone knows where that comes from. I don't believe it. I don't know if any of you do. It's currently 73.09%. Which adults are they asking? The ones that go to the leisure centres? I just wonder. Anyhow, that's, I think it's a rhetorical question. In the case of reduction of call volume into the customer contact centre, they give a Q4 number as an actual number of calls. to me, that's completely meaningless. I have no idea is that a high or a low percentage. I mean, you're doing apples, oranges, bananas there. I mean, so at least make them relevant. Jobs in the city created or saved by OCC. I think we discussed this last time. How on earth do we measure it? I mean, you know, and it's very precise. It's 137. I don't know. Is that good?
Yeah,
What on earth we're measuring?
I think there is some tracking through the capital programme of you know, jobs that are being taken on. That's where I would expect that to come from. Is the capital programme and our investment of the schemes that we're undertaking.
Or saved. That's the other thing. See, the saving. And you could say we saved something by not closing a centre or something. I mean, I really wonder. Anyhow, some of these seem rather amorphous, ill-defined targets. The improvement in overall city centre air quality, and it's very precise. It was 23.5% in the last quarter. What's that mean? I mean, I know it's not you who wrote it, but that's Mish actually. But to me, it's rather meaningless. Is it NOx? Is it PM 2.5? You know, which measure is it? I don't know. It doesn't seem to me to be terribly useful. Then we get a massive answer about the reduction of greenhouse emissions linked to our operations. Anyhow, you know, some of these I think need to be maybe made more readily understood. Let's put it that way. I think Jen, I was just going to say, Chair, that generally I think we can take that message back. I mean, I just don't know who do you coordinate this report, Alice? Is that right?
I think also we've got two versions of something very similar but slightly different, because as part of the integrated report, which I think, because I lost track there for a little while, but I think, James, you're following the one that's appended to the integrated report.
Yeah.
And there is also at the very bottom of the pack, there is another version, which are, look, I haven't done a full comparison, but they're two slightly different things, probably due to timings, I suspect, because I obviously have to follow the path through to cabinet, whereas because that the second version of it doesn't, it may be more updated. But I see Alice has got a hand up. So
Alice, maybe you can explain all to us.
Yeah, sorry, I've had to turn my camera off because of connection issues. But yeah, so the appendix for the scrutiny commissioned one is basically the KPIs that scrutiny decided they wanted to monitor for the year. So that's the difference. And Richard has taken over now. We contact one of our officers in the information governance team who sort of collates all of the performance data. So that's where that comes from.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I mean, what I would, sorry, if I could just make a general request. I mean, I've picked out things that to me are not consistent. You give a number one place and a percentage somewhere else. No, at least whoever finally collates it, please make them consistent. That surely, if you have to, you go back to the officer and just say, what is it as a percentage? And also some of these large explanations, I'm sure are very interesting, but I'm not sure they really explain what we're trying to get at. All we're trying to do is, we've got measures of performance targets. It'd be nice to know how we are faring. And even if we're not achieving them, I quite like the idea of knowing, and that's why I like year on year to see, are we getting better? And that really was what I would like to see, because that's the only real benefit to me from seeing this, rather than seeing just numbers in abstract. Maybe we could just, it's really a question of presentation.
Yeah. I've seen before where in terms of performance reports, you can have an arrow or going up or down, or basically to sort of indicate, give a ready indication as whether we're getting any better. I think we just need to take it back and just talk to the officer coordinating, who will then obviously liaise with the heads of service accordingly.
I mean,
Just to
I
sort of
do
try
like numbers rather than arrows, to be honest, just to
Yeah,
get the
okay.
sense. Is it 0.01% increase, you know? Anyhow, that's a general wish. Finally, the one which I actually was most surprised by, and the Q4 actual was over 7 million, was discretionary funding, where it says after obviously a good Q4, i.e. up to March, we got no successful bids. Is that because the government wasn't basically offering bids, or that we just had a very low success rate?
I think it's the former. So that it's just that there's been nothing out there for us to reach out to. I think generally as a council we're pretty good at putting in bids for additional funding and generally fairly successful. We just haven't been informed of any that we have actually been successful at year to date so far.
Okay. Do we have bids outstanding where we hope to get something?
I believe so, some certainly in the sort of environmental sustainability area. Nigel's nodding, so probably homelessness as well, I suspect.
There definitely bids out there, and there are some pending as well that will be going in very shortly. So hopefully we'll be, reporting that indicator will be going up, I think, at the next report, certainly.
I mean, because what is very worrying is, of course, how much one can't predict far ahead, how much funding you're going to get. I mean, they're changing from sort of greater stability to trying to get councils to compete with one another. It's all, to be honest, terribly sad and not very nice. So thank you very much. So I think just maybe the key point was I raised a few for me. I think more generally it would just be nice if this was slightly clearer, the comparisons year on year, which I think would be useful. And just in the notes, if there's something that needs a great little mini thesis, let's do it as a footnote somewhere else, because we just want to understand the basic trends. And at least it becomes clear how well we're doing in terms of improving our performance in difficult times. Is there anything else from you, Chris?
And I made a note of those points to raise with the person who takes them.
And so, nice, well, quicker than last time, nice and good. The dates of future meetings, we've got the one in December on the 7th. And then we have one which I think we may, all being well, decide to skip on the 23rd, because we've got all the budget ones coming up before that. And I think, Richard, you raised a question about the dates of the budget meetings, did you?
Yes, so I've emailed you the scoping document talking about potential meetings, which were simply the meetings of the budget review group last year. And I've changed them to 23 and asked whether they work for you. So I can certainly...
Could I ask, please, if I don't know how it is for officers, because, we're meant to get quite a few officers and so on to come along. I remember last year that at least one of the panel members, maybe family away from Oxford, couldn't make the first date. So we had to rejig the first date. I think that was Amir, actually, Councillor Latif. Could you maybe circulate those dates among the panel members, and obviously copy in people like Anna and Nigel, just to see how people react to those dates? Chris?
Sorry, not related to the budget review group dates, but just to flag again that I can't do the 7th of December meeting if it's in person, which, given that we're a smaller panel now and there are only 2 of us here tonight, without any apologies, may be an issue for the 7th of December meeting. But if it's on Zoom, I will be able to do it. So, yeah.
No, thanks a lot. I mean, this one has been nice and efficient, and maybe we will be glad. I'm happy to accommodate you if we have it, to go along with an online meeting. Thanks. So we should note that. But yes, if Richard, you can indicate that to the panel members, and then at least we can see. I think we took a kind of I don't know, doodle poll or something just to check dates. But if you say these are the proposed dates, do any of them not work, then we can see. Because after New Year, things take time to come back. Otherwise, if that's okay, I would like to thank everybody and the other panel member for making us 4-8. I couldn't do it on my own. And see you all. I'm sure I'll see you before December, but